Good morning. We're going to actually end David's life today, but we've got a little bit more to go before we can do that. So we have two readings today. The first one is 1 Chronicles 29, verses 22 through 24. Short reading. So go ahead and pause me and read 1 Chronicles 29, verses 22 through 24. Okay, this takes place after David has addressed an assembly of the Israelites, and it seems like David had 40,000 final words, but this is another of them recorded. They may all be the same, but this is another one recorded. And they anointed Solomon for the second time. So the first time they did it was after Adonijah had tried to take over the kingdom, and it was kind of a rushed, hurried situation. And this time they did it with all the pomp and circumstances. They probably did it at the tabernacle, and anybody was there. And in verse 23, Solomon sat on the throne of the Lord. And this is a big controversy, because these words have only been used in the Old Testament to indicate at this point something or someone sitting between the cherubim on the Ark of the Covenant. Now, just throwing it out there for you, not necessarily what it means this time, but just throwing it out there. And then at the end of this, all of David's sons, which this will be important later, pledged submission to Solomon. So that's the first reading. The second reading is 1 Kings 2, 1 through 12. It's 1 Kings 2, 1 through 12. So pause me again and flip over to that, read it, and then I'll be here when you get back. Okay, this is another of David's charges to Solomon. And again, it seems like we've got 40,000 of these. They may all be the same in just different interpretations or versions of that. But in verse 2 through 4, David is saying, again, he said this kind of before we've read, if you want prosperity, you need to be strong, you need to show yourself as a man, you need to observe the law, and you observe the law by walking in the ways and keeping the law, the commandments that God had given Moses. And then he says, if you always want to have an heir on the throne, which the Lord had promised David, then the descendants, the whole country of Israel, the whole nation, had to watch how they live and walk faithfully with their heart and their soul. So this is kind of a big deal. This is a big deal. This is a kind of a promise, kind of a covenant. You got to do this, and then you've got the kingdom sewed up. And then in verse 5, 6, and then we're going to skip on down to 8 and 9, we're going to talk about Joab and Shimei. And Joab was David's military leader, and he had killed Abner and Amasa in a time of peace. So that's a big no-no. Killing, bloodshed in a time of peace is a big no-no. So it kind of put the whole land under a curse. If you read Numbers 35, 33, it just basically says if this happened, your whole country your nation is under a curse. So not sure why David hadn't taken care of this before. We mentioned that maybe David was a little bit afraid of Joab because of the whole Uriah thing. Not sure. But he's saying here, don't let this guy die peacefully. And then the same thing about Shimei. David had vowed not to kill Shimei for cursing David. But then he says, now don't consider him innocent. So something might have happened, and he's kind of saying, watch out for him, but make sure he dies a violent death. Again, we're not sure why David didn't take care of all this stuff on the front end instead of having Solomon do it. But basically, David viewed these guys as potential enemies for Solomon. And even though he was a man of God, he was also a man of his culture, and that's just kind of the way they did things back then. They just, if you were going to be a threat to the king, then you were killed. So these guys had allied themselves with Adonijah, and David did not want to take the chance that they would try and usurp Solomon's throne. So also Joab was his nephew, just mentioning that again. And then we're going to back up to verse 7, and David says, show kindness to the sons of Barzillai. And Barzillai is a guy who stood by David. And what was interesting to me in all my study here was, in the middle of all this revenge and, don't let this guy go down peacefully and make sure this guy dies of blood, is this sweet little, and remember your friends. And Solomon wrote a proverb, even Proverbs 27:10, that says, do not forsake your friend or the friend of your father. So that was kind of a sweet note from David in the middle of all that. So at the end of this, David dies, and next lesson we'll finally be able to move on to Solomon as king by himself.